It was a quiet evening when I received the letter. It wasn't addressed to me specifically, but rather to the curious soul. The envelope, thick and heavy with age, had a strange aura about it. The wax seal, broken but still intact, depicted an old, ornate theater mask. I had never heard of the place or the sender, but the intrigue sparked by the mysterious invitation was enough to make me open it. The letter inside was brief, but the words seemed to jump off the paper, as if urging me to read faster. It read, "Dear curious soul, you are invited to spend one night at the Marlowe Theater, an abandoned relic of the past. Its curtains have not risen in decades, yet the spirits of the stage still linger. For one night, you shall experience what the living have only heard about in whispers. There are ghosts still acting in the theater, still playing their roles as if time had never moved forward. Join us, but remember, not all performances are meant to be seen." The handwriting was elegant, almost otherworldly, with a flow that didn't feel like the work of a modern hand. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read the words again. The Marlowe Theater? It was a name I had never heard, but the invitation felt like a summons, like something I couldn't ignore. I had always been drawn to stories of the supernatural, to places where the veil between the living and the dead was thin. An abandoned theater, said to still echo with the voices of ghosts trapped in an eternal performance. It was too compelling to resist. I thought about it for a moment. Ghosts on stage, actors trapped in their roles. It seemed like a strange, yet fascinating proposition. As a lover of mystery and the macabre, I had to see it for myself. The letter provided directions. A winding road leading to a distant part of town, a place I could barely locate on a map. It promised to lead me to a forgotten theater that had stood since the late 1800s, a relic from a time when the city was full of life and color. The Marlowe Theater had been a hotspot for actors and playwrights in its heyday, its velvet seats packed with eager audiences. But, according to the letter, a series of strange disappearances, performers, staff, and audience members had caused the theater to close down. The police could never explain the sudden vanishing of so many people, and eventually the theater was abandoned, left to the dust of time. I should have been more cautious. I should have questioned whether I was being led into something dangerous. But curiosity, as it often does, got the better of me. The day I arrived at the theater, it was as though I had stepped into another world. The grand building stood in stark contrast to its surroundings, looming in the dim light of twilight, its old brick facade covered in ivy and moss. The marquee, which had once advertised famous performances, was now blank, the letters faded and crumbling. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to return. I stood in front of the theater for a moment, hesitating. Something about the place made my heart pound a little faster, my breath catching in my chest. The building was silent, too silent, like it was expecting me. I could almost hear the faint echoes of laughter, of applause, reverberating through the walls, remnants of an era long gone. Shaking off my nerves, I stepped forward, pushing open the heavy wooden doors. They creaked in protest, but eventually gave way. Inside, the theater was a shadow of its former self. The grand foyer had once been gleaming, its marble floors polished to perfection, but now it was dusty, the air thick with the smell of decay. The chandeliers hung low, their once sparkling crystals now caked with grime, dimly reflecting the sparse light from the few candles set around the room. A gentle humming echoed through the halls. I turned toward the source of the sound. and there, standing at the top of the stairs leading to the balcony, was an old man. His attire was strangely formal, like something from another century, and his eyes gleamed with an unsettling, almost knowing look. "You must be the one they sent," he said, his voice raspy but polite. "Welcome to the Marlowe Theater. My name is Elias. I've been waiting for you." His eyes held mine for a moment too long, a flicker of recognition in them, as if he had been expecting me. But then, with a gentle motion, he gestured for me to follow him deeper into the theater. As I walked behind him, the air seemed to grow heavier, as though the weight of the building's past was pressing down on me. The halls were lined with paintings, faded portraits of actors and directors who had once walked the stage, their eyes seemingly watching me as I passed. "This place is more than just a theater," Elias murmured, his voice low. "It's a place of performances, yes, but also a place of tragedy. The actors never left, and neither did their audience." I shivered, but I couldn't help myself. My curiosity was now all-consuming, and despite the growing sense of unease, I was determined to stay. What was it that had kept the spirits of this place alive? And why had they called me here? Elias led me through the grand theater, the halls seeming to stretch on endlessly, filled with the faintest hum of voices, like a far-off conversation. It was strange. No one had been here for years, and yet there was an undeniable presence in the air. The grand staircase spiraled upwards, its banisters worn smooth from countless hands gripping them, and the smell of dust and old velvet lingered in the air. The flickering candlelight seemed to reflect off the faded gold trim, casting shadows that danced unnaturally along the walls. "Follow me," Elias said in his quiet, raspy voice. "You'll see the performance soon enough." I hesitated. There was something about his tone that sent a chill down my spine. It was as though he knew something I didn't, a truth buried deep within the theater's very walls. The closer I got to the stage, the more intense the feeling of being watched became. Each step I took seemed to echo in the vast emptiness, amplified by the high, cavernous ceiling above me. Finally, Elias stopped at the edge of the auditorium, the grand stage looming ahead. The velvet curtains were drawn back just a little, as though someone had been preparing for a show. The dim light from the candles flickered around the edges, casting the stage in a ghostly glow. "This is where the spirits act," Elias whispered, his voice filled with reverence. Or was it fear? "Where they've been performing for years, trapped in their eternal roles." As my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I could barely make out the faint outlines of figures on stage. Figures who seemed to move in and out of shadow. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I saw it more clearly. The actors. There, in the center of the stage, stood a man dressed in an old-fashioned costume, a worn velvet coat that looked like something from a century ago. He was speaking, but the words didn't make sense. They were lines from an old play, but they sounded distorted, like they had been spoken 1,000 times too many. The voice was haunting, carrying the echoes of something long forgotten. Behind him, a woman twirled in an elegant dress, her movements graceful but jerky, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes, when she glanced at me, were empty, vacant, as though she didn't even notice I was standing there. "Are they—" I began, but Elias didn't give me a chance to finish. "They're trapped," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with emotion. "These actors never left the stage. Their souls are bound to the performance. It's all they know now. They don't realize they're dead, still acting, still living out their roles." I took a step forward, drawn by the odd magnetism of the scene unfolding before me. The theater was in disrepair, the once magnificent seats now worn and cracked, but somehow the performance felt as real as anything I had ever seen. The actors were so immersed in their roles that they couldn't see me. Their movements were mechanical yet fluid, as if they were reliving their lines on an eternal loop, forever trapped in a play they could never escape. The man on stage, the one who had been speaking, stopped and turned toward the woman. His face was a blur, obscured by shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me now. His mouth didn't move, but the words were clear in my mind. "You should not have come here." I froze, a cold chill rushing down my spine. The message was unmistakable. The ghosts knew I was here. But why had they spoken to me? Did they want me to leave? Or were they simply trapped in this endless cycle, unable to break free? The woman, now still, turned to face the audience, except there was no audience. She glanced into the empty seats of the theater and then back toward me, her face expressionless. But there was something in her eyes, something that seemed to recognize me, something that made my stomach turn. She raised her hand and beckoned me forward, her movements graceful and fluid, but somehow off. "Join us." The words were clear, though spoken in the same haunting voice as before. The invitation was chilling, like the theater was calling to me, urging me to become part of the performance, to step into their world. I couldn't help myself. I took a step toward the stage, my feet moving of their own accord. As I approached, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper, as though the darkness was alive, wrapping itself around me. The closer I got, the more I felt as though the theater was swallowing me whole, pulling me into its grip. Elias, who had remained silent this whole time, suddenly grabbed my arm, pulling me back with surprising strength. "Don't go any closer," he warned, his voice now urgent. "You don't know what they're capable of. Once you step into their world, there's no turning back." I pulled away from his grasp, but I was mesmerized by the ghosts on stage, their performance becoming more intense, more desperate. They moved in unison, as though they were acting out the same scene, over and over again. Their faces twisted in agony, yet their bodies continued to move in perfect harmony. It was as if they didn't even know they were dead. They just acted. Elias grabbed my arm once more and pulled me back into the darkened hallway leading away from the stage. "The ghosts don't know the truth," he said, his voice strained. "They think they are still alive. They need help, but they cannot hear you. They cannot hear the living." I glanced back toward the stage, where the figures were still caught in their eternal dance, their souls trapped in a place between life and death. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized. This theater wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding off the energy of anyone who entered, trapping them in a loop that could never be broken. And I was starting to fear that I might never leave. Elias led me through the darkened corridors of the theater, his steps echoing against the worn walls. The strange performance on stage was still vivid in my mind. Those actors, so deeply immersed in their roles, unaware of me, but somehow aware at the same time. The more I tried to shake off the images of the haunted stage, the more they clung to me, as though the theater itself was seeping into my thoughts. "This way," Elias murmured, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. He led me toward a dust-covered room at the back of the theater, its door slightly ajar. As we stepped inside, I noticed that it was filled with old stage props, forgotten costumes, and stacks of aged scripts. The air in the room was thick with the scent of decay and old paper. There was something eerie about the room. It felt like a time capsule locked in the past. "What is this place?" I asked, stepping further inside, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had started to settle in my chest. "This," Elias said, his voice low, "is the heart of the theater. It's where the play was written, the play that cursed the theater." He pulled an old manuscript from one of the shelves and handed it to me. The pages were yellowed and fragile, the ink slightly faded but still legible. I opened it carefully, unsure of what to expect, but as I scanned the first few pages, a shiver ran down my spine. The script was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its language was odd, full of strange symbols, the lines twisted in a way that made my eyes ache as I tried to read. "This play," Elias said, watching me closely, "was never finished." The actors were rehearsing it when the disappearances began. I flipped through the pages, but as I read the words aloud, I felt a strange sensation. The letters themselves seemed to come alive, the lines blurring as if they were shifting before my eyes. It was as though the script was not just a play. It was a gateway to something far more sinister. "What happened to the actors?" I asked, my voice trembling as the words became more cryptic. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a seat in a nearby chair, his expression distant. He looked as though he were caught between reliving something painful and trying to protect me from it. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "They disappeared, one by one. At first, it was subtle. Actors would leave the theater for a break, but then they didn't return. Crew members, too. No one knew where they went. It wasn't until the police were called that we realized the theater itself had become something else." The air in the room grew heavier, and I could feel the temperature drop. My skin began to tingle with an unfamiliar energy. I glanced back at the script in my hands, feeling an undeniable pull, like the play was calling to me. But what happened to them? Why are the ghosts still here? I pressed, my voice growing more urgent. Why are they stuck in the performance? Elias took a deep breath, as though the weight of the truth was too much for him to bear. The play was cursed. The actors, every one of them, became part of it. They were chosen to perform the final act, a ritual that was meant to bind their spirits to the theater. But it went wrong. The curse wasn't meant to keep them trapped. It was meant to give them immortality, to keep the theater alive, to feed off their energy and their devotion to their roles. I stared at him in disbelief. Immortality? A curse? This wasn't just about ghosts haunting the theater. It was about something far more dangerous, something that had been lurking in the shadows for far too long. The more I read from the script, the more the words seemed to warp in my mind. They were alive. I was sure of it now. I could feel the ancient power that had been locked in these pages, an unnatural force that still held the theater in its grip. Every line I read seemed to pull me deeper into the story, as if the play itself was rewriting my fate. The ghosts aren't aware they're dead, Elias continued. They think they're still performing, still waiting for the audience, still living out their final scene. But they're trapped in an endless loop, forced to act out the same scenes over and over again. And every time someone enters the theater, the curse grows stronger. The actors are forced to rehearse their roles until they can no longer remember who they were in life. They're stuck, part of the play and part of the theater, and soon it will claim you too. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. It sounded insane. Trapped souls, cursed plays, endless performances. It was the stuff of legend. of stories told around campfires, not something I should have been facing in the cold reality of a haunted theater. But as I looked around, I realized that everything I had experienced so far, the whispers, the strange actors still on stage, their eyes unseeing but their movements so deliberate, was true. This wasn't a legend, it was real, and I was in the middle of it. The stage, the script, the curse, it was all linked, and I was starting to realize that I hadn't just stumbled upon a haunted theater. I had wandered into something far darker, far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The play had never been finished, and the actors weren't just waiting for an audience. They were waiting for someone to finish the final act, to give them the ending they never received. But what would happen if the play was completed? Would they finally be free, or would something else be unleashed? I had to find out. There was no turning back now. The room seemed to grow colder as Elias finished speaking, the weight of his words settling heavily in the air. I could still hear the faint hum of the performance from the auditorium, the sound of the actors on stage continuing their lines, seemingly unaware of our presence. The energy in the theater was palpable, as if the building itself was alive, feeding off the history and pain embedded in its walls. Every inch of the space seemed haunted, but it wasn't just the ghosts that lingered here. It was something deeper, something that refused to die. Elias looked at me with a weary, resigned expression, like someone who had witnessed far too many of the theater's dark acts and had learned to live with the inevitable. "The curse isn't just about the actors," he said, his voice quiet, almost as though he feared the walls themselves might overhear. "It's about the performance. It's about the endless loop, the unwillingness to break free. These spirits, they are not at peace. They've been trapped in the play for decades, unable to remember who they were, unable to leave the stage. Their roles have become their identities, and they can never escape." The truth began to sink in, and I realized the true horror of the situation. The spirits of these actors weren't simply stuck haunting a building. They were prisoners in their own lives, trapped in an eternal repetition, endlessly reliving their final act until they no longer remembered what it was to be alive. "The play is a prison," Elias continued, his eyes dark with understanding. "And it's always hunger. The play needs to be finished. The curse needs to be fulfilled. The souls of the actors need to be freed, but no one can finish the final act without becoming part of the performance." I stared at him, my mind spinning with the gravity of the situation. He was telling me that if I completed the play, if I acted out the final scene, the actors would be freed, but so would I. The performance would consume me, pull me into the same endless loop that the spirits were trapped in. I would become one of them. I could hear the actors on stage, their voices rising in intensity, their movements becoming more frantic, as if they were caught in the final moments of the performance. Their expressions, frozen in desperation, seemed to pull me back toward the stage. The urge to step into their world, to complete the play, grew stronger with every passing second. "I have to stop this," I said, more to myself than to Elias. I was torn, unsure whether I should break the curse, set the actors free, or whether I should leave the theater and forget everything I had seen. But my feet were already moving, drawn by the compelling energy in the room. I had to know how it would end. Elias stood up, his face suddenly grave. "You don't understand. The curse doesn't just trap the spirits, it feeds off the living. If you complete the play, you'll become another spirit, another ghost bound to the stage, playing your part for eternity. You'll be another actor, lost in the script." "But I have to finish it," I insisted, my voice shaking. I could feel the pull of the theater drawing me back to the stage, like a magnet, each step toward it, leaving me feeling less like myself and more like part of the play. I can't leave them like this. They deserve to be free. The quiet tension in the room was broken by the sudden, sharp sound of footsteps behind me. I turned to find a figure standing in the doorway, a man in a long coat, his face obscured by shadows. He was holding a mask in his hands, one of those antique theatrical masks that the actors wore on stage. "I wouldn't go out there if I were you," the man said, his voice deep, almost whispering. Elias tensed, his face darkening. "Who are you?" The figure stepped forward, lowering the mask. His face was familiar, but I couldn't place it. There was something in his eyes, something ancient, that seemed to reach deep into me. "I am the last to try," the man said, "the last to finish the play." Suddenly, I remembered. He was one of the original actors, the first one to vanish, the one who had disappeared long before the others, the man whose soul had been consumed by the performance. "The theater was my prison," he continued, his eyes hollow, "and now it will be yours." I took a step back, a cold wave of realization sweeping over me. I had walked into something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. This theater wasn't just a place where ghosts lingered, it was a trap, a place where the line between life and death was blurred, and the only way to break the curse was to take the stage. The figure in the doorway took a step toward me, his hands outstretched as though he were trying to pull me into the darkness with him. "You don't want to finish the play," he said softly, almost sadly. "Once you do, there is no turning back. You become part of it. You become part of the performance, part of the curse, and you'll never be free." Elias stepped forward, holding up his hand to stop the man. "You don't understand," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "You think the curse can be broken, but it cannot. It will keep feeding, keep pulling others in. If you finish it, you will not escape. You will become another ghost, another actor forever stuck on the stage." I stood, frozen in place, the weight of his words crashing over me. But even as I stared into the eyes of the lost soul, something inside me urged me to finish the play, to free the trapped actors. I could feel the pull, stronger than ever. The theater's heavy atmosphere pressed down on me as I stood frozen in place, caught between the truth of what Elias had said and the undeniable pull of the stage. The abandoned theater, with its decaying grandeur and haunted history, seemed to be alive, its walls pulsing with ancient energy. The air grew thick with tension, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a choice. Elias's voice cut through the silence. "You don't understand," he said, his tone strained. "The play isn't just a performance. It's a curse. You'll never leave here once you step onto that stage. The spirits of the actors will claim you, and you'll be trapped in this endless cycle, just like they are. The theater will feed on you, your energy, your soul." But even as he spoke, I could feel my body moving toward the stage, as if it had a will of its own. The pull was irresistible, the compulsion to end the play, to free the trapped souls, overpowering any fear I had. The ghosts of the actors were waiting for someone to break the curse, and I couldn't turn my back on them. They had been trapped for too long, condemned to replay their final moments over and over again. I glanced at the man, the original actor, the first soul to fall victim to the theater's curse. He stood in the doorway, his face expressionless, yet there was something sad in his eyes. Sadness, yes, but also emptiness. a soul who had already given in to the theater's demands. The lines of his face had become etched with years of torment, and his once vibrant eyes were now hollow, consumed by the endless play. "If you finish the play," Elias warned, stepping closer to me, "you'll never escape. You'll be one of them." I hesitated for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Could I really sacrifice my freedom, my life, to help these ghosts? But then I looked back at the stage, at the actors who were still trapped, still performing their roles, unaware of the passage of time or the reality of their fate. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I had to do it. It wasn't just about them. It was about breaking the cycle, about freeing everyone who had ever stepped foot in this theater, about releasing these trapped souls from their eternal performance. With a final glance at Elias and the actor in the doorway, I walked toward the stage. My feet moved of their own accord, the darkness pulling me into its depths. The curtains, once heavy and still, now seemed to part before me, as if guiding me to the center of the stage. The ghosts, the actors, were still in the middle of their performance, repeating the same lines and gestures, unaware of my presence. Their faces remained frozen in their respective roles, but there was a flicker in their eyes, a recognition, as if they knew what was about to happen. I reached the center of the stage, and as I did, I felt a strange sensation, a shift in the air, a change in the energy. The walls of the theater seemed to close in, and for a brief moment the room became silent, the actors' movements still. I could feel their gaze on me, the weight of their long-buried desperation seeping into my skin. They were waiting for someone to finish the performance, to give them the ending they had never received. I stood at the center, facing the empty audience. The curtains on either side hung like walls, suffocating the space, but the stage felt vast, expansive, alive with history. The lines of the script in my hands, once strange and unreadable, now seemed familiar, as if they had been written for me, as if this was my role, my destiny. The final scene loomed ahead. I could feel the words vibrating in my chest, as though the theater itself was urging me to speak them, to bring an end to the eternal performance. And so I began to speak, my voice trembling at first, but slowly gaining strength. The lines flowed out, each word coming naturally, as though the script had always been a part of me. The actors on stage, still lost in their roles, began to respond, their movements perfectly synchronized with mine, as if the script had finally unlocked something within them. They spoke, they moved, they acted, but it wasn't their performance anymore. It was mine. As the scene unfolded, I could feel the curse tightening around me, but also something else. Freedom. The energy that had once seemed so oppressive began to shift, the walls of the theater no longer pressing in on me. The spirits of the actors seemed to be awakening, realizing for the first time in decades that they were no longer bound to the play. Then, in a moment of realization, the actors stopped mid-performance. They looked at me, their eyes no longer vacant, but full of recognition. For the first time, they were aware. They had been freed from the endless loop, and now they could leave, could move on. But there was a price. The curse had been broken. The final act had been completed. But the theater's hunger was not so easily sated. The theater's power had shifted, and now it was reaching out to claim a new soul, mine. The ground beneath me seemed to crack, and the stage began to tremble. The actors slowly faded from view, their forms disappearing into the air, but I knew they were gone, free. The theater, now silent, stood as it had before, a place of history, a place of eternal performance. But as the theater settled into its silence, I felt a chill running through me, and the whispering began again, softer this time, almost like a distant memory. I had freed them, but in doing so, I had become part of the performance, part of the theater's history, and my soul would forever be bound to the stage. The silence in the theater was deafening. The actors had faded, their souls free at last, but something lingered in the air, something darker than the empty seats, darker than the hollow space where the curtain had once been drawn. The energy of the theater had shifted, like a final, aching breath exhaled into the stillness. The once oppressive weight pressing on my chest had lightened, but as I stood there, I felt a strange sensation creeping into my bones. I had done it. I had freed the spirits. The play was finished. But the moment I spoke the final words, the moment I completed the act, I realized I was no longer just an observer. I had become part of the performance, part of the curse. I could feel it now, the pull, the subtle force that tugged at me, as though the theater itself had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many others before. The stage, the walls, the very air around me seemed to close in. I could hear the faintest whispers, as though the theater was speaking to me, calling me, beckoning me to stay. I took a step back, feeling my body grow heavier with each movement. I tried to turn, to walk away, but my feet felt rooted to the stage. The familiar lights above me flickered, and in the corner of my eye I could see shadows moving across the seats, too distinct to be part of my imagination. Then the curtain began to lower on its own, slowly, deliberately. The final act was not yet over, and as the fabric fell, I realized with a sickening jolt that the theater had claimed its next actor, me. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, trying to move, trying to escape, but the force of the theater held me in place. The stage felt like a trap, like a cage of lights and shadows that would never let me go. The whispers turned into laughter, echoing from the walls, from the seats, from the very ground beneath me. The ghosts of the actors, no longer trapped in their roles, were now watching me, their eyes full of sadness, yet they seemed to know something I didn't. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the theater was suffocating me, blocking me from breaking free. My throat tightened, my chest grew heavy. I tried to move again, but my legs felt as though they were frozen, rooted in place like the actors before me. It dawned on me with a slow, creeping horror. The curse had passed to me. I had completed the play, finished the final scene, but the price had been paid. Suddenly, the lights dimmed completely, plunging the theater into pitch darkness. For a long moment, I stood in the blackness, unable to move, unable to think. I felt the air grow colder, the silence pressing down on me with suffocating force. And then, as quickly as the darkness had come, a blinding light erupted on the stage, illuminating me in the center. I was back at the beginning, the opening scene of the play. The script I had read earlier, the one that had seemed so cryptic, was now crystal clear. I recognized the lines, the words, the roles. The theater had reset, and I was the lead. The final act was mine to perform, and there would be no exit, no way out. The stage, once a place of despair, now felt like a living entity. I could feel the weight of the audience's gaze on me, their eyes unseen, but their presence unmistakable. The curtain stood open, and the theater seemed to be waiting, its walls filled with the unspoken anticipation of a play that was never meant to end. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words were not mine. The lines poured out of me, words I had never learned, sentences I had never read. They were part of the play, part of the performance that had now consumed me. I spoke the words, acted the role, and as I did, I felt a shift in my very being. I was no longer just a witness. I was the actor, the lead, destined to repeat this scene for eternity. I glanced into the empty seats, now filled with the faint glow of long-dead audience members, their faces pale, motionless, as if they had been trapped in the theater's cycle as well. But now, it was my turn. I was the one who would continue to perform, continue to rehearse, and never leave. The final words of the play echoed through the theater, and I realized with a sickening clarity that I had become the next actor in an eternal performance. The ghosts had been freed, but in doing so, the theater had claimed a new soul, and now there would be no escape, no release. I was trapped. The curtain began to fall again. It was over, and I knew as the theater dimmed around me that this performance would never end. The ghosts would never leave, and neither would I.